Today, when someone mentions Antichrist, almost everyone imagines the same thing: a specific character, an ultimate leader, someone who appears at the end of the story to face God before the definitive outcome. This image is so common, many people think it has always existed like this, as if from the beginning Christians had read the Bible and concluded, without much discussion, that all those different texts were talking about the same figure. But when we start to look more calmly at the biblical texts themselves, something curious appears. The pieces are not as uniform as they appear. There is a term called Antichrist, but it appears in a very specific place in the New Testament, in the letters attributed to the Apostle John. There, the term does not exactly describe a great eschatological character who will dominate the whole world. In fact, the text speaks of antichrists in the plural, as a kind of opposition, a pattern of denial about who Jesus is. Meanwhile, at another point in the New Testament, a different figure appears, the so-called man of lawlessness, described in Second Epistle to the Thessalonians. Already in the book of Revelation, another striking image appears, the beast that rises from the sea. And even before that, in the visions of the book of Daniel, the enigmatic figure of a small horn that grows between empires. 4 texts, 4 images, 4 different languages, and none of them originally are born saying in all the words that they are describing exactly the same character. It may seem like a small detail, but this is where the story starts to change direction, because the question that Christian readers have faced over the centuries has not been just, who is the Antichrist? The question was a little more complicated. Like these images, written at different times with different styles and even different purposes, could they fit within the same story about the end times? In other words, these figures should be read separately or as parts of a single portrait. Today, for many people, the answer seems obvious. But for much of Christian history, it was still open. And it is exactly at this point that the investigation begins. Because before the Antichrist that the modern imagination recognizes existed, there were only texts and interpretations trying to understand how they fit together. If we want to understand how the modern idea of Antichrist came about, the first step is do something very simple. Return to the original textual map. In other words, look at the biblical texts that were later associated with this figure before they are stitched together into a single narrative. And when we do that, one thing quickly catches attention. These texts were not born as chapters of the same story. They appear in different contexts, with different languages and with different concerns. Different. Let's start with the only place where the term Antichrist actually appears. In the letters attributed to John, especially in the First Epistle of John and the Second Epistle of John. There, the term appears in a very specific way. John writes to Christian communities who were dealing with internal conflict, disputes about who Jesus really was. In this context, he uses the word Antichrist not to describe a world ruler future, but to talk about people who denied the identity of Christ. And the most curious detail appears in the way the term is used. John says that many antichrists had already arisen, not just one. This changes the scenario quite a lot, because at this point, Antichrist functions more as a spiritual or theological category than as an eschatological character. something that identifies a type of opposition, not a final figure in history. Now compare this with another text that often enters the conversation. There appears a very different character. Paul describes someone called a man of lawlessness, or a man of sin, depending on the translation. This character is presented as someone who exalts himself against everything that is considered divine and who places himself in a position of worship. The text also talks about a mystery of injustice that is already in action, but that will still be revealed more fully. Notice how the focus here is different. This is not about internal disputes in Christian communities. The scenario seems broader, more dramatic, more eschatological. Even so, the text also does not use the term antichrist. He describes a figure, but with another language and another framework. Now we move on to a third, even better known set of images, the book of Revelation. In chapter 13, a figure appears that would become one of the strongest images in history, Christian tradition, the beast that rises from the sea. Here, the literary style is completely different. The apocalypse uses intense symbolic language, AC hive of numbers, hybrid creatures and images that echo older prophetic visions. The beast is described as a force that receives authority, exercises power, and enters into conflict with the saints. But again, the text does not call this figure the Antichrist. She is simply the beast within that apocalyptic vision. And if we go back even further, we find another important piece. In the visions of the book of Daniel, especially in chapter 7, the figure of the so-called little horn. Daniel describes a sequence of empires symbolized by animals. In the midst of these kingdoms appears a small horn that glows, speaks with arrogance, and challenges divine power. This vision already had a profound influence on Jewish apocalyptic imagination long before the New Testament to be written. And it's interesting to note how the images begin to approach each other, at least in tone. There is arrogance, there is opposition, there is confrontation with God. But still, each text is speaking within its own setting. Daniel describes visions about kingdoms. Revelation uses symbols to talk about power and persecution. Paul speaks of an eschatological character linked to the mystery of injustice. John speaks of false teachers who deny Christ. 4 texts, 4 contexts, 4 languages. It may seem like everyone is pointing to the same thing, but originally they weren't necessarily being read like that. This distinction changes more than it seems, because the great question that would arise for Christian interpreters in the following centuries, it wouldn't simply be identifying a final villain. The question would be different. How to deal with these different images that seem to talk about the same type of threat, but which appear in completely different narratives. And it was precisely in trying to answer this question that the process of interpretation began to take a new direction. After we look at this textual map, Daniel, letters from John, Thessalonians, Revelation, it is clear that the first Christian readers were faced with a real challenge. The texts existed, but the relationship between them was not so obvious. And this is an important point in the story, because we often imagine that Christian interpretation began with a system already ready, as if from the beginning there was a clear, organized, and accepted eschatological line everywhere. But in practice, the first centuries of Christianity were much less stable than this. the communities were spread across different regions of the Roman Empire, each facing their own pressures. Some dealt with political persecution, others faced internal conflicts over doctrine. And in this environment, biblical texts were read, trying to answer questions well concrete. Who are the true followers of Christ? Who is distorting the apostolic teaching? How to recognize signs of opposition to the faith? It is within this context that eschatological images begin to gain importance, but not like an end-of-the-world movie script, but rather as languages to interpret present crises. For example, when John talks about antichrists in Christian communities, he is dealing with an immediate theological dispute. When Paul speaks of the man of lawlessness in the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, it responds to concerns about the timing of Christ's return. And when Revelation uses images of beasts and empires, it speaks to a scenario of imperial power and persecution. Each text is born trying to interpret a type of historical tension. But there is a curious detail in all of this. Even though these images are different, they share some similarities. They all talk about opposition to God. They all describe some type of arrogance or rebellion. All suggest a confrontation between human power and divine purpose. And this is exactly where the interpretative tension arises, because Christian readers began to notice something. These figures were not identical, but they weren't completely strangers to each other either. It may seem like a small detail, but it was enough to raise an inevitable question. Could it be that these texts are describing different threats throughout history? Or are they all pointing in different ways to the same type of final opponent? This type of question did not appear centuries later. It began to emerge very early in the history of Christian interpretation. And it wasn't just intellectual curiosity. It was also an attempt to organize the reading of Scripture in a coherent way. Because the more the texts circulated among the churches, the more natural it seemed to try and understand how they related to each other. The impulse was not to create a great villain in an apocalyptic narrative. It was something simpler. Create a reading criteria, a way of understanding whether these images should be seen as parts of the same frame, or as distinct episodes within the story or in the Christian faith. And it was precisely in trying to answer this question that some interpreters began to do something new. They began to bring together texts that had originally circulated separately, not yet as a complete system, but as first attempts at interpretative sewing. And it is at this point that some names from the Christian tradition begin to enter history. When we reach the 2nd and 3rd centuries of Christian history, something begins to change in the way how these texts are read. Until then, as we have seen, there were several images spread throughout the Scriptures. Antichrists in the letters of John, the man of lawlessness in Thessalonians, the beast in Revelation, the little horn in Daniel's visions. These figures circulated in the texts, but the relationship between them was still under construction. It is at this moment that some Christian authors begin to try to organize this puzzle more directly. Among them appears an important name, Irenaeus de Lyon. Irenaeus writes at the end of the 2nd century, in a period when Christianity was still consolidating its doctrinal basis. One of the great challenges of that time were disputes with movements that they presented different interpretations of Christ, creation, and salvation. Within this scenario, Irenaeus is also interested in biblical passages that talk about opposition to God and about the final destiny of history. When he comments on texts such as those in Revelation and the book of Daniel, it begins to emerge an idea that would later become very influential. The idea that these different images could point in some way to a same final antagonist. Irenaeus does not write a complete eschatological system like those that would emerge centuries ago, later. But he already suggests something important. It tries to bring together symbols that were previously read more independently. For example, when reflecting on the number 6666 in Revelation, Irenaeus discusses the possibility of it being linked to a future ruler who would oppose God. At this point, the apocalyptic text begins to be read not just as a symbolic vision about empires, but also as a reference to an eschatological character. A few decades later, another author expanded this movement even further. The Roman theologian Hippolytus of Rome. Hippolytus writes detailed commentaries on the book of Daniel and also on themes eschatological. And in his texts, something appears that begins to look like a more conscious of connecting different biblical passages. He notes similarities between the little horn of Daniel, the beast of the apocalypse, and the character described in Second Epistle to the Thessalonians. For Hippolytus, these figures would represent related manifestations of the same type of final opposition against God. Realize what's happening here. These authors are not inventing new images. They are working with texts that already existed, but they are taking an important interpretive step. These images are getting closer, starting to treat them as pieces that perhaps belong to the same eschatological scenario. However, this movement is not yet a consensus. It is an interpretative proposal. Other readers continued to see these passages more separately. Some emphasize the historical context of each text. Others preferred to keep the images within their own prophetic narratives. In other words, at that moment in Christian history, there was still room for more than one path. Interpretative. It may seem like just a detail of ancient exegesis, but this is where something decisive starts to happen. Because when interpreters begin to connect different texts, they also begin to build a larger narrative that ties these passages together. And little by little, what was once a set of images scattered throughout the scriptures, it starts to look like something more organized. Not yet a fully defined character, but something that is already beginning to take shape as a more unified eschatological figure. The curious thing is that at first, this did not seem like an interpretative revolution. It just seemed like an attempt at a coherent reading of Scripture. But it was precisely this attempt at sowing that paved the way for a development much greater in the following centuries. Because from that moment on, Christian interpreters were no longer just reading texts isolated. They were starting to ask, what if all these images are part of the same story about the end? After interpreters such as Irenaeus of Lyon and Hippolytus of Rome began to approach some of these biblical passages, the scene of Christian interpretation entered a phase interesting. Connections were starting to appear, but there was still no single model that everyone followed. In practice, 3 different ways of organizing these images began to circulate among Christian readers. 3 possible ways to deal with the same set of texts, and each of them was trying to solve the same problem. how to interpret those figures scattered throughout the Scriptures. Let's look at these three paths. 1. The most scattered reading. This first path was, in some ways, the simplest. He kept the images within their own contexts. In this type of reading, the Antichrist mentioned in the first epistle of John remained being understood as John describes it, a type of opposition that was already present within a Christian community, not necessarily a unique character that would emerge at the end of the story. Likewise, the man of lawlessness of the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians could be seen as a specific eschatological figure, without this obliging a direct link with the symbolic visions of the apocalypse. And the images from the book of Daniel continued to be read within their own setting prophetic, linked to the history of kingdoms and empires. In this model, similarities between texts were recognized, but they were not enough to merge everything into a single figure. Each passage continued to speak within its own horizon. 2. The reading that begins to unify. The second path started from a different observation. Some interpreters began to notice that despite the differences, these figures share certain traits: opposition to God, arrogance, confrontation with the faithful, attempt to usurp authority. And when these characteristics began to be compared side by side, a interpretative hypothesis. Perhaps these passages were not describing entirely independent threats. Maybe they were different ways of talking about the same type of final opponent. In this model, the little horn of Daniel, the beast of Revelation, and the character of Thessalonians could be seen as related manifestations within a same eschatological narrative. Not necessarily with all the details the same, but pointing to an antagonist who would concentrate these characteristics at the end of the history. This reading began to produce something new, a kind of end times narrative line. 3. The most systemic reading. There is also a third path that also appears in some traditions. Interpretative. In this model, the focus is not so much on identifying a specific character. The focus is more on structures of power and opposition that appear repeatedly throughout history. Empires that pursue, authorities who exalt themselves, movements that deny the Christian faith. In this type of reading, biblical figures function as symbolic patterns that are manifest themselves at different historical moments. Not like the detailed description of a single individual that will emerge at the end. This approach maintains a certain distance between images. They share themes, but they continue to function as symbols within varied historical contexts. Now, notice something interesting. These three paths try to answer the same question: how to fit different texts into a coherent reading of the story. But each one does it in a different way. One keeps the images separate, another begins to connect them around a final antagonist, and the third understands these figures as recurring patterns within human history. And here appears a curiosity that changes a little the way we think about the subject. For a long time, the main question wasn't exactly, who is the Antichrist? The question was different. Which of these forms of reading best organizes the entire Scriptures? And depending on the answer each interpreter gave, the final image of Christian eschatology could take very different directions. Because if scattered reading had become dominant, perhaps today the idea of Antichrist was much less central. If the systemic reading had prevailed, perhaps we would talk more about historical patterns of opposition than of a final character. But little by little, one of the paths began to gain more space than the others, and this didn't happen by chance. So far, we have seen three possible paths living side by side. Some interpreters kept biblical images separate. Others began to connect them around a final antagonist. And there were also those who preferred to read these figures as patterns that are repeated throughout of history. For a long time, these forms of reading circulated together, but as Christianity grew, a new kind of need began to appear, the need to organize teaching. In the first centuries, Christian communities were spread across different regions of the Roman world, and little by little new tasks emerged. Teach new contexts, respond to interpretations considered distorted, explain faith more clearly. And when this process begins, something also changes in the way biblical texts are presented. Because it's one thing to read different messages within their own contexts. Another thing is to teach a coherent vision of salvation history. It may seem like a small detail, but this is where the logic of interpretation begins to come into play, transform. When the Christian faith begins to be taught in a more systematic way, a natural tendency transform the mosaic of texts into an organized narrative. Instead of several independent images, it starts to make sense to tell the story in sequence. Creation, fall, redemption, and finally, consummation. Within this narrative structure, the eschatological passages also become organized in a more linear way. The question is no longer just what each text means in isolation. The question becomes, where does this passage fit into the full story? And when interpreters start asking these kinds of questions, some solutions, interpretations gain the upper hand, especially those that can connect different texts within the same plot. The figure of a final antagonist, someone who combines characteristics of the little horn of Daniel, the beast of Revelation, and the character described in the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, begins to offer exactly this type of organization. It transforms several scattered images into parts of the same story, a story with a beginning, development, and climax. This does not mean that all interpreters immediately agreed with this solution, but she had a practical advantage. It helped explain many different texts at once, and when an interpretation manages to do this, it tends to become very useful in teaching, especially when faith needs to be communicated to entire communities, not just discussed among scholars. There is also a human factor in this process. When you need to explain something complex to many people, you inevitably simplify some things, not out of carelessness, but because communication needs to work. And little by little, without it happening overnight, the mosaic of images eschatology begins to reorganize itself, no longer as independent pieces scattered throughout the scriptures, but as elements of a single narrative about the end of history. And it is precisely at this point that Christian interpretation is about to cross a decisive moment. So far, what we have seen has been a gradual process. Different texts, different readings, and several attempts to understand how these images could relate to each other. During the first centuries of Christianity, there was still a certain flexibility interpreted. Some authors approximated the figures. Others kept each passage within its own context. But at some point in history, this situation begins to change. The interpretative sowing that was previously just a proposal begins to transform into dominant pattern. And this change does not happen suddenly. It happens slowly, along the transition between late antiquity and world medieval. It may seem like just a change in theological style, but looking closer, it's more than that. It is a change in the way Christian knowledge begins to be organized. In the early centuries, many theological texts were written as responses to debates, specific. But as time passes, the Christian tradition begins to produce something different. Great compilations, systematic comments, syntheses that attempt to organize the set of Christian doctrine. This movement creates an environment where interpretations that can integrate several texts at the same time start to gain an advantage. And the idea of a final antagonist that brings together characteristics of several biblical figures offers exactly this type of integration. At this point, images like the little horn from the book of Daniel, the beast described in Revelation, the man of lawlessness from the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, and the term antichrist present in John's letters begin to be treated more frequently as parts of the same scenario, eschatological. Not because the biblical text changed, but because the way of organizing interpretation was changing. It may seem like a technical detail, but it changes a lot of things. Previously, these passages were often read as different episodes of opposition to God. Then they begin to be aligned within a narrative sequence, as if each text revealed an aspect of the same final opponent. This type of organization has some clear advantages. It simplifies teaching. It creates a story that is easier to communicate. And it offers a framework that connects Old and New Testament prophecies within of the same eschatological line. Over time, this reading began to circulate more and more in biblical commentaries, sermons, and theological compilations. And when an interpretation starts to appear repeatedly in these environments, something interesting weave. It no longer seems like just a possibility. It starts to seem like the natural way to read text. This is how an interpretative proposal becomes tradition. Now imagine for a moment a different scenario. If the readings that kept these images more separate had become predominant, perhaps the Christian imaginary was different. Perhaps we would talk much more about various historical forms of opposition to God. Perhaps the term antichrist would continue to be used primarily, as John did, to describe a type of denial of Christ that can appear at different times. But when the unifying reading gains strength, the landscape changes. Biblical images begin to function as pieces of a larger portrait. A portrait that describes an eschatological antagonist capable of bringing together characteristics spread across several texts. And little by little, this way of organizing biblical material also begins to shape the Christian imaginary, not just among theologians, but between entire communities. Because once a narrative becomes clear, coherent, and repeated, it becomes also memorable. And when that happens, interpretation stops being just an academic debate. It begins to shape the way entire generations imagine the end of history. From this point on, Antichrist is no longer just a term that appears in a set card specific. He comes to be understood as the great final antagonist of the Christian eschatological narrative. But for this image to really consolidate itself in the collective imagination, it still needed an important step, a step that would take place in the medieval world. After the interpretation that unified these figures began to gain strength, even there was one thing missing for her to truly become dominant. She needed to leave the theological debate and enter Christian culture. And that is exactly what began to happen throughout the Middle Ages. During this period, Christianity was no longer just a movement spread across small communities. He was deeply integrated into the organization of European society. Monasteries, cathedral schools, manuscript copying centers, and educational networks passed to play a huge role in the preservation and transmission of knowledge. This includes, of course, the way the scriptures were interpreted. Biblical commentators began to organize increasingly detailed explanations about books like the Book of Daniel and Revelation. And in these comments, the tendency to bring together different eschatological figures continued to grow stronger. Daniel's little horn, the beast of the apocalypse, the character described in the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, and the term antichrist is present in John's letters. Increasingly, these images were presented as parts of the same scenario, about the end of the story. But something even more interesting happens during this period. Interpretation does not only circulate in theological books, it also begins to appear in preaching, religious literature, and even representations artistic. Stories about the final antagonist begin to be told in sermons. Narratives about the end of times appear in devotional texts and chronicles. And little by little, the Christian public begins to become familiar with the idea that the story moves towards a final confrontation between Christ and a great adversary. It may just seem like repetition, but repetition has a powerful effect. When the same interpretative structure appears in biblical commentaries, in teaching religious and popular imagination, it begins to seem more and more natural. The fusion of different biblical figures is no longer perceived as a choice-specific interpretation. It comes to be seen as the very way of reading texts. There is also an important detail in this process. Medieval culture highly valued the idea of narrative order. Stories were organized into clear sequences. Events were connected within a historical line that began at creation and progressed towards final judgment. Within this type of worldview, the presence of a well-established eschatological antagonist defined made a lot of sense. It functioned as the final tension point of the narrative, the figure who concentrates the conflict before the definitive restoration. And so, little by little, the image of the Antichrist becomes more and more familiar, not just as a term present in some biblical passages, but as a central character in a larger eschatological story. A story that now seemed to integrate Daniel, the apostolic letters, and the apocalypse within of the same scenario. By the time we reach the end of the Middle Ages, this interpretative framework is already in place, widely spread. It appears in biblical commentaries, in theological treatises, in popular narratives about the end of times. And it is at this moment that something curious happens. That one which began as an attempt to connect different texts is now so incorporated into the tradition that many people come to imagine that it has always been this way. But when this narrative reaches the modern era, it will still undergo new adjustments, and these adjustments will shape the image of the Antichrist that many people recognize today. When we reach the modern era, most of the structure was already in place. For centuries, interpreters had approximated different biblical passages. Later, in the Middle Ages, this approach gained strength through commentaries, teaching religious and cultural repetition. Now, what starts to happen is not exactly the creation of a completely new. It's something a little different. It is the refinement of a narrative that was already in circulation. At this moment, Christian theology is going through a process of organization that is increasingly detailed. Authors begin to produce works that attempt to systematize the entire Christian doctrine into large, coherent sets. These works seek to answer questions such as, what does the Bible teach about God? About Christ? About the church? About the end of the story? Within this organizational effort, eschatological passages are also reorganized. Texts that speak of opposition to God, persecution of the faithful, and final judgment become analyzed side by side. And the figure of the final antagonist begins to appear more and more as a central piece of this frame. Now it's no longer just about connecting images. The eschatological narrative begins to gain a complete structure. A more defined sequence of events is created, signs that precede the end, periods of conflict, the emergence of a great opponent, and finally, the definitive triumph of Christ. In this scenario, biblical images such as the little horn from the book of Daniel, the beast of the Apocalypse, the man of lawlessness described in the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, and the term Antichrist present in the letters of John start to function as complementary descriptions of the same character, eschatological. This type of organization has an interesting effect. It transforms a set of texts with very different styles into a story relatively easy to count. A story that has characters. It has a sequence. It has a climax. And when a biblical narrative takes on this kind of form, it becomes much easier to understand. Transmit, especially in contexts of religious teaching, preaching, and popular literature. This is why, over recent centuries, many people have grown up listening to the Antichrist described as a specific leader who will appear at the end of the story. Someone who concentrates in himself several biblical images of opposition to God. But there is an important detail in this process. The figure of the Antichrist that many people imagine today did not arise directly from a single biblical text. It emerged from a specific way of organizing several texts at the same time. A form of reading that has been constructed, discussed, and refined throughout the history of Christian interpretation. This does not mean that biblical texts have disappeared or changed. They remain the same. What changed was the way these passages were fitted into a larger narrative. And when this narrative became dominant, it also began to shape the way as many people read these passages today. However, to fully understand this process, we still need to look at one detail in, not just what the texts say, but how did the history of interpretation turn these images into an idea, recognizable in the modern imagination. If we now go back to the beginning of the conversation, that initial certainty starts to seem a little different. The idea of a single, clearly defined and inevitable Antichrist at the end of history. It seems so natural today that many people imagine it was always there, ready inside of biblical texts. But when we follow the historical path of interpretations, the landscape becomes more interesting. the texts were always there. The book of Daniel with its visions of kingdoms and the little horn. The apostolic letters talking about conflicts and opposition within Christian communities. The character described in the Second Epistle to the Thessalonians. The powerful symbolic images of Revelation. None of that has changed. What changed was the way these pieces began to be organized throughout the history. At first, they circulated as different images, each with its own setting. Then came readers trying to understand whether these images had any relationship with each other. Some preferred to keep them separate. Others began to connect them. Over time, the reading that unified these figures proved to have some advantages. It organized the set of texts better. It created a clearer eschatological narrative, and it facilitated the transmission of Christian doctrine. Little by little, this way of reading spread, first in biblical commentaries, then in theological teaching, then in the collective imagination of Christian communities. And so, what began as an attempt to stitch together different texts ended shaping the way entire generations came to imagine the end of history. It may seem like an academic detail, but this kind of process reveals something important about the history of interpretation itself. Biblical. Many of the ideas that seem obvious today have gone through periods of discussion, comparison, and interpretative choice before they become predominant. The modern Antichrist is a clear example of this. It did not emerge from a single passage. It arose from a specific way of reading several passages together, a form that has been built over centuries. And when this construction finally consolidated, it didn't just organize texts, it also shaped the eschatological imagination of much of the Christian world. In the end, understanding this story does not change the biblical texts, but it changes the way we see the path that led certain ideas to become so family members. Because now, it's easier to understand something. The Antichrist that many people recognize today did not appear ready-made in history. He was taking shape